Welcome to Alaska Weather, a production of Alaska Public Media and the National Weather Service, Alaska Region. Produced and broadcast daily from the studios of KAKM, Alaska Weather provides complete forecasts, public, marine, and aviation for all of Alaska. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.
Good Wednesday, everyone. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider with the National Weather Service. It's the 6th of August. As always, we encourage you to stay up to date with your latest weather information no matter where you are in Alaska. You can do that by going to weather.gov/Alaska or listening to your NOAA Weather Radio. Your weather info line is open at 800-472-0391. You'll get your latest forecast that way or find information during the day on Twitter, on Facebook, and on YouTube. Of course, YouTube in the late afternoon will give you your surface map briefing for the entire state. That's a short little clip there that gives you just enough information to kind of whet your palate for the full Alaska Weather Show that you're watching now. Of course, if you missed bits and pieces of this or you want to go back and watch it again or share it with your kids or maybe grandma, you can do that easily by going to YouTube and typing in the top bar AKWX TV for the full half-hour show, or go to our public partner, our alaskapublic.org broadcast partners, what I'm trying to say. You can find the viewer there on the right-hand side of the screen. Here's what's coming our way. A Bering Sea storm that's already in the Bering now is bringing gales, kind of low-end gales to the Aleutians, and probably some periods of heavy rain eventually to parts of southwest Alaska before the week is through. By Friday, heavy rain along the Gulf Coast and Prince William Sound is expected. Some of that across the eastern side of the Kenai Peninsula and into Prince William Sound could total well over 2 inches of rain in some cases. And then gales along the North Slope could bring some high surf. So we're watching several areas for some changes just in the next 48 to maybe 60 hours out, about a day and a half to 2 days out or so. So some things are certainly changing, and it all has to do with the position of that area of low pressure out in the Bering. One thing that will probably change over the course of the next couple days is, again, that very limited but certainly present fire danger, with high levels of fire danger still seen up around Kotzebue Sound and the south-facing slopes of the Brooks Range, and also around some parts of the Copper River Basin. It's fairly isolated, and just a few areas are showing those drier conditions, but again, it is certainly worth watching. Always a good idea to be fire-wise and fire-safe. Out across the Bering, here's our low pressure system right now. You can see that spinning still generally north and west of the Pribilofs. It has 2 areas of circulation. This is the main one right now. The secondary part of this is back across the west on the very easternmost coast of Russia. It's dragging in Pacific moisture and has a pretty tight pressure gradient with it, but like I said, we're only seeing low end gales across most of the Aleutians. There were some stronger gusts around Adak today. It looked like they may briefly reached 50 knots or so. Also seen just on the very bottom of your screen is one of the typhoons out across the western Pacific. As those get going in the next couple months, it is certainly a source of moisture that gets fed into the Gulf of Alaska from time to time, so we're beginning to see the starting stages of that process now. As you look at the visible satellite picture across southeastern Alaska, you notice some of the holes in the clouds across southeast. There was some light rain across northern parts of southeast today. For example, Juneau picked up about 5/100, certainly not a wet day for you at all. Out across the Copper River Basin, a broken stream of moisture working northward is feeding into cloud buildup across south central and southwestern Alaska has seen enough sunshine and daytime heating that thunderstorms are popping once again across eastern sections of Norton Sound and into the YK. We saw some lightning activity yesterday, and once again across the Alcan and areas in the central and western Yukon. Storm clouds are slowly drifting from east to west, and some of those could easily reach their way into the eastern part of the interior. Dry weather generally north of the Yukon Valley today, and you can see some cloud buildup as well across the interior of the Seward Peninsula. Across the Arctic coast, clouds are generally limited to areas in the Beaufort Sea, a little bit of drier weather west of the Barrow. And then here's our storm out across the Bering. The position is still west of St. Matthew and northwest of St. Paul. Now, this circulation has an awful lot of wind with it, and the moisture working its way into south and western Alaska will start to park its way or move its way there and then park as we get into Friday and probably Saturday. Then the system will gradually reorganize here south and west of Kodiak Island and focus some of the wetter precipitation and periods there across western parts of Prince William Sound and the Kenai Peninsula and probably Kodiak and southwestern Alaska. Let's take a look at the surface charts then, and you'll see a frontal boundary that's draped right across the interior. It's not a whole lot to write home about, but it is focusing showers and storms across the Yukon and some parts across the eastern interior. We had some storms pop up once again, second day in a row, across the Norton Sound coastline and into the northern parts of the Yukon Delta. And then our system out across the west at 987 millibars is really starting to drop the pressure across the central and eastern chain and across the southwestern coast. As it does so, the winds are coming up there, and they'll continue to pick up from west to east. And the good news is places like the central and western Aleutians will see diminishing winds and waves as we go into the next couple days, so look for some gradual improvements there. The heaviest rainfall will likely reach the coast as we get into probably tomorrow. Meanwhile, showers are still popping up outside of the northern Gulf Coast, across the western Alaska Range, and across southeastern Alaska, with generally dry weather elsewhere, a little more cloud cover up across the north. Heading into tonight, we'll still watch for some showers and thunderstorms across the northern Yukon and also across the upper Tanana Valley. Showers across the middle and upper Yukon Valley and the south-facing slopes of the Brooks Range. We're looking for some light rain across southeast. All around the Gulf Coast really is possible, with a better chance in the higher terrain in the mountains anywhere else. Kodiak will start to see some rainfall developing tonight, the heaviest of which probably getting there sometime tomorrow. The frontal boundary is still west of the Shumagon Islands and Nunivak Island, as well as Cape Newenham. The pressure's down to 986 millibars, and you'll notice the wind shift here going through Unalaska, Dutch Harbor, Nikolsky, Adak, and Atka will have already seen it by this point. The front will still be intact, but you notice this little kink in that pressure pattern here. We're going to watch for an area of low pressure to form west of Kodiak and start to allow the northern part of the storm to weaken somewhat. So that process will begin as we get into tomorrow. We've got a smaller area of low pressure forming there at 995 millibars, but that will also refocus some of the moisture into Kodiak Island, the southern Alaska Range, and eventually parts of Prince William Sound will see this as high pressure is shifting southward. Areas in southeastern Alaska will start to see a better chance for some light rainfall there. Rain and thunderstorms possible across the Alcan border, with showers across the Brooks Range and generally light and spotty across the middle Yukon Valley. Most of the Tanana Valley and areas around Fairbanks look pretty dry at this point. Across the north slope, pockets of cloud cover and fog generally east of Barrow, maybe even east of Prudhoe Bay and Deadhorse. Across the Chukchi Seacoast, even into parts of Kotzebue Sound, conditions should be fairly dry. There is an opportunity for some showers and thunderstorms tomorrow afternoon, though, even around Kotzebue and maybe up to Kivalina. Probably not as far west as Shishmaref, and as you get into Norton Sound, conditions dry up until you get closer to the front there. The winds become a little bit more westerly eventually through the Bering Sea west of St. Matthew and the Pribilofs, so conditions a little more showery. You might even see some breaks in the clouds across the central and western chain. As we get into Friday, the front is reorganizing and the system is just kind of spinning and wobbling its way into the western Gulf. And notice that tighter pressure gradient now is focused across the central and eastern Gulf, kind of opening the door for a stronger push of moisture right into the northern Gulf Coast. That puts a better bullseye for some heavier rainfall across the eastern part of the Kenai Peninsula and western Prince William Sound. The Cook Inlet region may see a little bit better chance for some steadier rainfall on Friday than any other day this week. Southwestern Alaska is still close enough to the low pressure system that waves of rain may be working through, occasionally heavy. And showers are still possible for southeastern Alaska, but you may have a better shot of wetter weather going into Saturday and Sunday. And rain and thunder possible across the south-facing slopes of the Brooks Range and generally north of the Yukon Valley. The Seward Peninsula looking at a better chance for some light rain Friday. And another trough of low pressure will drop southward, focusing occasional showers and lower visibility and maybe some gustier winds at times across the chain, generally for the central and western parts of the Aleutians especially. Temperature-wise today, conditions were fairly mild across southeast, 63 in Juneau and Sitka, Ketchikan and Annette, everyone holding in onto some milder weather as we move into mid-August there. 57 in Yakutat, Middleton Island was 55 degrees. Cordova and Valdez in the upper 50s to lower 60s, and that was pretty much the trend for most of south central Alaska today. Anchorage made it up to 66, Kodiak was 58, Talkeetna a pleasant 59 degrees, and 65 in Glen Allen. Once you got over the mountains and up toward Healy, temperatures were generally in the lower 60s, though Fairbanks was much warmer at 68 degrees, Fort Greely at 69. Eagle and Northway also in the mid-60s today. Tanana was about 66. 61 for Fort Yukon, lower 60s for Anaktuvuk Pass, 40s to about 50 degrees for most of the Arctic coast. Kaktovik was fairly mild today, even though you don't see it on the map. 64 around Wainwright, mid-60s to lower 70s across Kotzebue Sound. Kotzebue is 73 degrees, and with heat like that again tomorrow and moisture and instability increasing in the region, once again, watch for some thunderstorms in the region. 61 in Nome, 70 around Ruby and Galena. And as you move into Norton Sound, temperatures from there southward into the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta were pretty much in the 50s and 60s. Bethel was looking at 62. Ammonok was closer to 57 degrees, about the same there in Hooper Bay. As you move down toward Bristol Bay, temps were also in the upper 50s and lower 60s. A pretty popular temperature today around King Salmon at 63 degrees. We saw similar conditions there from Port Hayden, Pilot Point, all the way down to Cold Bay, False Pass, Dutch Harbor, and Unalaska, about 60 there. Lower 50s for St. Paul and St. George. Now, one thing to note about, I believe it was Cold Bay and also St. Paul, it wasn't the warmest day you've ever recorded, but it was one of the warmer nights you recorded. Yesterday, temperatures held in the lower 50s, setting a record warm low for that date. So again, a sign of how warm and probably wet the air is moving in across south and western Alaska. Mid-50s there for Adak and Atka, and Shemya showing 53 as we go into the afternoon. Now out across the west, you can see that moisture and that warm air working its way up the Yukon Valley. Temperatures there in the lower to mid-50s overnight. Look at Kotzebue Sound. Closing into Kotzebue itself, temperatures could hold in the mid to upper 50s as that warm and wet air works its way northward. So got a lot to work with tomorrow. Lower to mid 50s there around Bristol Bay, the Alaska Peninsula, 53 in Kodiak, upper 40s and lower 50s for a good part of southeast. South Central, generally about 50 degrees. Fairbanks fairly close to 50 as well. 38 in Eagle though, up to 70 there tomorrow. The Arctic coast should see temperatures in the mid 40s overnight. High temperatures tomorrow, that is. Seward Peninsula probably closing in the mid-60s. Most of south and western Alaska, including the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta, in the lower to mid-60s. The Alaska Peninsula will see temperatures in the lower to mid-60s. St. Paul and St. George closer to 54. Unalaska and Dutch Harbor, 57, about 59 in Kodiak. South Central, mid to upper 60s, and southeast, lower 60s tomorrow. Flying weather calls for IFR across most of the Arctic coast, especially east of Barrow. Widespread IFR from eastern Russia through the Alaska Peninsula and Kodiak, with MVFR lingering for southeast and also a good part of the south and western coast. Pass conditions show Anaktuvuk Pass heading for MVFR during the day. Same goes for Adigan Pass. A better chance of the storms west, though. Lake Clark and Merrill Pass, MVFR conditions by the end of the day. We'll see similar conditions in Rainy Pass. Windy Pass we'll call VFR. Same goes for Isabel Pass tomorrow. Mentasta Pass, we expect to see visual flight conditions there with a chance of storms. Tanita Pass should be VFR. Porter's Pass we expect to see turn over toward MVFR, especially on the eastern side. For now, we'll say VFR for most of Cook Inlet, and Chilkoot and White Pass should see some gradual trends toward improving weather. Freezing levels have warmer air lurching northward toward St. Lawrence Island, but you'll notice there's still a cold pocket remaining across southeast and south central with levels as low as 8,000 feet, and across the Beaufort Seacoast, levels are as low as 6,000 feet there. Icing potential is pretty high up there. Above 10,000 feet, you do run the risk of running into some light to isolated moderate rime across south central tomorrow and also across southwestern Alaska, the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta, and out across the Bering. Generally, though, pretty high up there, above 12,000 feet. The jet stream shows low pressure dropping southward and running more of a stronger northerly flow right across the north and western coastline. The main player, though, is the core of the jet stream working its way across the central Aleutians, about 150 knots there, so it's just screaming along, and about 70 knots there moving eastward across the Pacific Northwest. So a lot of energy moving through. 40 to 55 knots across the southern Bering Sea. At 9,000 feet, we've got another wave of low pressure across the northern Gulf. 10 to 20 knots there, and more of a north and easterly flow working across the Arctic coast. Some of those winds could get up there about 20 to about 30 knots or so, with light winds elsewhere across the interior. So your main issues with speed and probably shear will be along the west and southwest coast and along the Aleutians once again tomorrow. At 3,000 feet, you can see light winds coming in from the south and west. They pick up a little bit more coming into the ridge around 20 knots just west of Sitka. Otherwise, light winds continue across the interior, a northerly flow across the Arctic coast, and for the Alaska Peninsula and the central and western chain, those winds are around 20, 40, even 50 knots in some cases, generally just north of Unalaska, with more of a southerly flow coming across Bristol Bay at 30 knots. So turbulence potential, we haven't really drawn so many bright colors there on this map in a while, but with this first storm coming through the Bering, we're going to see some elevated levels of turbulence potential anyway. So south of Kodiak Island, probably below 4,000 feet. Around the mountains there in southwestern Alaska, probably expecting occasional moderate. And then once you get south and west of St. Lawrence Island and also west of the Pribilofs, north of Adak and Etka, watch for some increased opportunity for some occasional moderate there. Otherwise, just around the storm in particular, light to isolated moderate should be expected also along the Arctic coast below 2,000 feet, and we'll have more on those winds with your marine weather in just a few minutes. Stay tuned.
Determination of true wind speed and direction is often difficult from a moving vessel. In this case, we're moving ahead at about 20 to 22 knots in this direction. The relative wind speed moving this way, as you can see by my hair and my shirt, blowing like this. Whereas in actuality, the true wind is coming from this direction and moving this way at about maybe 8 to 10 knots. This can be seen by the surface small breaking waves.
The most common and reliable way of estimating true wind speed and direction is by observing the wind's effect on the sea surface. These effects have been organized into a comparative scale called the Beaufort scale, recorded in knots. Ranging from calm, with the sea like a mirror, all the way up to hurricane force winds, the Beaufort scale associates sea conditions such as breaking waves, boiling sea, foam and spume with wind speed. A practiced observer will note such features as whitecaps or the formation of larger waves. The appearance of streaks and spray are important indicators of wind speed. Of course, wind waves always move in the direction the wind is blowing, so they indicate true wind direction. Your guide to sea state, wind, and clouds provides illustrations and descriptions of waves to help you apply the Beaufort scale. It's an approximate system, but can be quite accurate for an experienced observer. Once again, code your entry for wind direction. Wind speed is recorded directly in knots. Forecasters need to know present and past weather conditions, including cloud development. This is your appraisal of the conditions as you observed them during the past 6 hours. For example, conditions such as snow, or fog, or squalls, or other phenomena such as lightning or funnel clouds are coded as numbers as specified by the code card. The handbook gives the details on how to report the various kinds of weather phenomena and their subcategories. Clouds are a good predictor of changing weather. Proficiency in cloud identification is a combination of practice and study. There's a gradual transition between the various types of clouds, which can make identification difficult. The most reliable observations of clouds are made by keeping as close and continuous a watch as possible on their development. The National Weather Service posters and guide can be a great help in this. Cloud heights will have to be estimated. Sometimes objects near the horizon can offer perspective. Estimate the height above the sea at the base of the lowest clouds seen. Also, estimate the fraction of the sky covered by clouds of all types. This is a general observation and not of specific kinds of clouds. Visibility is always an estimate. The experienced observer learns to gauge visibility based on the appearance of the horizon. But where there are aids to navigation and other ships, the most precise measure of visibility is with the use of radar.
Two important parameters on the standard shipboard meteorological observation are waves and swell. Now, a swell is merely a wave that has outrun the wind. Now, off in this direction, we can see the swell moving in. It's characterized by that larger, smoother movement coming toward the ship about from 30 degrees off the port bow here. Whereas the locally induced wind waves, which are usually of smaller period and a choppier appearance, are superimposed on top of that swell. Now, they are locally induced by the wind. In this case, the wind is coming from this direction. And you can see the crests of the little small wavelets breaking, coming in this direction.
Characterizing waves and swell can sometimes be difficult. Waves generated by a local and often changeable wind can be irregular in size and shape. Wind shifts can produce confused seas. Look for higher, better formed wind waves. Remember, wind waves are superimposed on the swell and can come from a different direction. Swell height is measured from trough to crest. Wind wave height is also measured from trough to crest, but not including the height of the swell. Wave period is the time between passing crests, measured in seconds. This and wave height, measured in half meters, are entered on the form. Swell comes from outside the local wind area and can come from more than one direction. The form asks for the direction, period, and height, as well as any secondary swell. Your wave and swell observations are important to forecasters. Ships and cargo are more easily damaged by large seas than by the wind.
On a container ship, it's the cargo, the boxes. We can lose containers over the side, damaged by weather and sea, and heavily damaged. And you want to avoid something like this.
Satellite images can show the overall extent of sea ice. But because of cloud cover, forecasters still require on-the-spot observations from ships or from shore to get a complete picture. If you sight ice flows when operating in high latitudes, consult the coding and descriptions contained in the observation handbook. More common is ice that accumulates on the ship. It occurs from ocean spray or combinations of spray, rain, and fog. Of course, all these phenomena are a function of air and sea temperature and dew point. Air temperature, sea temperature, and dew point are reported in Celsius, and it's critical that they be as accurate as possible.
Funny he should mention ice there. Today's sea ice edge across the Arctic coast shows, still looking at some ice concentrations generally north of Prudhoe Bay and west of Kaktovik, mainly just a little bit east of the village as well. We got some pretty broad open areas north of Kaktovik, but then of course it fills in just a little bit to the west, and we still have melting going on. Probably going to see a lot more melting in the next couple days as we get more of a southerly flow. However, that is going to be pushed pretty hard by an easterly flow that could come up to gale strength there. You'll see that in just a minute across the North Slope. Across southeasterly areas there, we've got 10 to 15 knot winds across the southern inner waterways. Across the Lynn Canal, you're looking at more of a southerly flow with a 4-foot sea on 20 knots. Southeasterly is coming up the coastal areas around 10 to 15 knots with 5-foot seas expected. By Friday, those winds are still coming up to 20, even 30 knots as you get closer to the northern coast. About 10 to 14-foot seas are expected in those areas. 3-foot seas still on the inside with winds coming up to about 15 knots in all areas in southeast and the inner waterways for Friday. For the Gulf Coast and west, look for easterlies inside of Prince William Sound with a 4-foot sea. South and easterly winds across the northern coast into the eastern part of Prince William Sound. Southeasterlies coming into the Barrens at 25 knots with a 5-foot sea. And easterlies continue to strengthen west of the Barrens, up to 8-foot seas expected. There, northeasterlies coming down Cook Inlet, 10 to 15 knots. And 25-knot winds coming over Kodiak Island from the east. That's 25 at 7-foot seas. And across Shelikof Strait, an easterly wind should bring up seas to 6 feet or so on Thursday. Northeasterly winds will kick in on Friday there with an easterly flow coming through the Barrens at 35 knots. Southeasterly winds moving toward Prince William Sound and Middleton Island, and easterly winds inside of Prince William Sound up to 30 knots with a 7-foot sea. And northeasterlies coming down Cook Inlet at 20 to 25 knots with 5 to 6-foot seas there. Across the Alaska Peninsula, 20 to 35 knot winds on the north side and about the same there for the south side. Seas up to 9 to 12 feet in the Pacific and 5 to 10 feet on the Bering side. Inside Bristol Bay, that's 5 feet alone. 4-foot seas are expected by Friday as winds diminish on the Bering side, becoming a little more variable south and west of Castle Cape and east of Chignik with an 8-foot sea, 9-foot seas south of Sand Point and King Cove with a southerly flow developing north of Cold Bay with a 7-foot sea there. Across the Aleutians, a broad westerly flow will be expected Thursday with 25-knot winds. Seas anywhere from 9 to 11 feet between Okolski and Unalaska, and 11 to 13-foot seas are expected on the Pacific side with 8 to 9-foot seas in the west. By Friday, you'll see more of a north and westerly turn kicking in again behind that storm wave. Atka, Adak, all the way out towards Shemya, looking at 25 to 30-knot winds with 9 to 10-foot seas. Otherwise, westerlies continue for Adak to Nikolsky and Unalaska, 25 to 30-knot winds with 9 to 10-foot seas in the Pacific. For the west coast, an easterly flow coming off of Hooper Bay in the YK Delta to St. Lawrence Island, 30 to 35 knots with a 9 to 11 foot sea there, and southwesterlies for the Pribilofs into the Kuskokwim Delta at 20 to 25 knots with 8 to 11 foot seas, the highest of which out around the Pribilofs. For Friday, north and easterly winds start to develop, and we see winds diminish somewhat. A 25-knot wind from the north and east over St. Lawrence Island is expected. 5 foot seas north of Nunivak Island. Lighter winds across the Kuskokwim Delta region with a 4 foot sea there, and northerlies for St. Paul and St. George with a 7 foot sea along the coastal waters there. Now for the Arctic coast. For Thursday, easterlies are expected 25 to 30 knots from Barrow eastward toward Kaktovik with 6 to 7 foot seas, and east to northeasterly winds across the Chukchi seacoast. Northeasterlies 20 knots outside of Kotzebue Sound. Friday, though, the winds really start to pick up as low pressure is moving a little bit more to your south and west. In this case, a northeasterly wind off of Cape Lisburne and Point Hope could come up to 40 knots with a 10 foot sea, and 11 foot seas are possible off of Point Lay and Wainwright, again, as winds are still moving pretty strong from east to west. So watch for the winds, and again, potential for gale force winds by the end of the week in some of these areas. As we recap tonight's weather pattern and go ahead the next couple days, a frontal boundary is working through the eastern Bering Sea as we head into tonight and early tomorrow morning, sweeping across the Alaska Peninsula with periods of gusty winds and low-end gales primarily for the central and eastern chain and the Alaska Peninsula. Southwestern Alaska will have the first taste of some potential heavier rainfall. Some areas there picking up more than 1 inch or 2 inches by the time we get toward the end of the week. Spotty storms are possible across areas generally south of the Yukon Valley. As we get into Thursday, a better chance northward, including some areas close to the Kotzebue Sound coastline. The eastern parts of Alaska could see some storms, and also looking at some heavier rainfall developing closer to Kodiak Island by the end of the day, and rain will start to develop across the Gulf Coast for Friday. Thanks for watching Alaska Weather.
These forecasts are to be used for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.
Cook Inlet Tug and Barge is a marine transportation company specializing in harbor services with a primary marketing focus on the Port of Anchorage, providing their customers with quality-based service specifically tailored to their needs.